Carolyn.
Of course.
Thank you all for joining us at Darien Library this evening to explore Olana, the home and masterwork of the 19th century artist Frederic Church. Church's Olana, located in Hudson, New York, is one of the most widely recognized artists' homes and studios in the world. Leading us on this evening's tour is Carolyn Keogh, the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Olana Partnership, which manages the Olana State Historic Site in a cooperative agreement with New York State Parks. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at the Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections, available to the community. I hope everyone's ready to visit the extraordinary beauty that is Olana. I'm now going to pass the mic over to Carolyn.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. And I have to tell you, I'm such a fan of libraries and all that libraries do. As was mentioned, I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Olana Partnership, and we work very closely in partnership with our local libraries to make things happen. I feel like when in doubt, a library can get it done. So I'm very happy to be here. I see some questions Sharon typed in, can we visit in person? And so thankfully I'll talk a little bit about Olana and how you can visit and what's going on there this summer. We have some exciting things happening. We are open and free to the public. So as was mentioned, we work closely with New York State Parks. We are a New York State Park site and historic site. So you're more than welcome to come and visit for free. There's 250 acres to explore. So with that, I think, why don't we dive into those 250 acres and start our experience. So the framework for my conversation with you all today is this idea of place as artistic inspiration. And so I wanted to explore Olana through that lens. How are people and artists inspired by places? And how can artists create places? Many times those of us who work at Olana and who work for the Olana Partnership, which is the friends group that supports the interpretation and education at Olana, we often refer to Olana as an earthwork, a creation that was made not only to be as a family home, but as a piece of experiential artwork. So I just wanted to say hello. As I mentioned, I'm Carolyn. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs. Here I am at Olana. And as mentioned, today we're going to be thinking a little bit about the lens of place as a focal point for artistic inspiration. Oftentimes we think of Olana itself as a lens through which we can think about different topics and how we can explore the inspiration that one man, Mr. Frederic Church, gleaned from this region, the Hudson River Valley. So I'm dialing in from my home in Hudson, New York. I'm not on site at Olana right now, but I'm excited to talk to you all a little bit about Olana. With this, I do want to mention that while this is a webinar, I hope that it can be conversational. I invite you all to type into the chat and type your Q&As in as we go. And I wanted to just kind of generate a question with you all before we dive in, which is, what is a place that has inspired you in your own life? We're going to be thinking about this theme overall, so I invite you all to type some thoughts into the chat. Oftentimes, I think what can be so powerful about visiting a place like Olana is that we can make our own personal connections to the story of the place, to the history of the historic site, and sometimes to the artist's own inspiration. So I see some feedback coming through in the chat. Sharon mentioned the Alhambra, and I'm excited that you mentioned that, because that may come up when we dive in and visit and spend some time looking at the main house at Olana. Rosanna mentioned Nettles Yard in Cambridge, UK. And I love that both of these sites that have come through on the chat so far are international sites. So sites that we might visit, places that we might vacation. Gail, thank you again for your positive feedback about Olana. It's memorable and inspiring inside and out. We appreciate that, and I have to agree. So I hope those of you who haven't been in person will feel that by the end of our tour today. But something that I love that came through just in a few of the responses is Old City Jerusalem from Sandy, Stonehenge and Hawaii from Gail. So you all are prolific travelers, which is definitely something that Mr. Frederic Church was also. So we're going to talk a little bit about how his global travels and some of his experiences across the world fueled his design and his creation of Olana. Also how his eye towards the Hudson Valley and his real respect and admiration for this region of the United States also plays into Olana. So one more from Linda Angor-Watt. I love it. So keep those places in mind as we go through. And I think that hopefully you'll be able to find some resonance in the story of Church and his Olana. Great. So something, oh, I see. If possible, if attendees feel comfortable, you could, oh yes, so we can definitely do that during part of the Q&A as well. So before we dive in and talk all about Church, I wanted to start and backtrack a little and talk about another very important figure to this story, which is Thomas Cole. Who is Thomas Cole? So Thomas Cole was an important Hudson River school painter and someone that comes into play as a large role in Mr. Church's life. Thomas Cole was someone that Frederic Church became very close with. They were very close friends. He was also a mentor and was his teacher. And the reason why I wanted to start with Thomas Cole here is because he wrote the essay on American scenery, which I highly recommend as some reading that you could do to get inspired if you're thinking a little bit about nature and about our relationship with nature in this country. And something that I like to think about is the historical context of what was happening in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, when Church starts to buy the parcels of land that later become Olana and starts to think about this creation, the creation of this place. So just to kind of give us some context for this, Cole writes, "Poetry and painting sublime and purify thought, and rural nature is full of the same quickening spirit. It is in fact the exhaustless mine from which the poet and painter have brought such wondrous treasures, an unfailing fountain of intellectual enjoyment where all may drink and be awakened to a deeper feeling of the work of genius, a keener perception of the beauty of our existence, and a more profound reverence for the creator of all things." So just to give us some context, during the time Cole was writing this, the landscape in this area was being very farmed, and there were many trees and many areas of land that were being deforested. So we actually have a current artwork that was just installed by a contemporary artist by the name of Jean Shin, which I'll show at the very end of our talk today. And she's an artist that was thinking and kind of going back, examining the history of how many of the hemlock forests in this region, in the Hudson River Valley and the Catskills, were completely deforested for the tanning industry. So this was something that Thomas Cole and Frederic Church would have been keenly aware of. These were things that were happening in the American landscape that they were attuned to. And so I just wanted to kind of take a step back and think about that historical context in terms of our own relationship with the American place, the American landscape. For those of you who may not be familiar with Church, I wanted to give kind of a crash course in his history. So in 1826, he was born in Hartford, Connecticut, one of the founding members of his family is one of the founding families of Hartford. As I said, he studied with Thomas Cole. He moved to New York City in 1840s. In the 1840s and 50s, he begins to travel throughout the world. He's very inspired by many of his travels to the wilderness, to specific ecosystems. And this is something that we're going to talk a little bit about. In April 27th of 1859, I mentioned this one artwork and we'll talk about why, but he debuts Heart of the Andes publicly in New York City, which is an artwork that catapults him to fame. In 1860, he purchases the first plot of land that would later become Olana. And in 1872, after he had purchased the land on top of the site, which we'll talk about, he moves into the second family home that he was building. It was just, it wasn't fully completed at that point, but as he and his family move into the top floor. And so we'll talk about all this a little bit. So I mentioned his artwork, and I mentioned that he was catapulted into fame. So Church definitely becomes an art star in the 1800s. I wanted to bring in two works before we talk a little bit about Olana, just so that you can get to see kind of what his works were like and what he became most well known for. So one that I wanted to point out is Niagara here, which he completed in 1857. And this came from visits that he had been making to the border. So in 1856, he starts to go to Niagara Falls, and he actually begins painting and working, capturing the scenery there in order to make an effort to preserve the natural beauty of the falls. He actually began a campaign to establish public parks along both sides of the Canadian and American borders at Niagara Falls. So I think that this brings to mind the notion that Church is not just a landscape painter, but he's someone who's thinking very much about the importance of the American landscape, the importance of specific places. And I like this piece about how important create public parks was to Church, because now park quite famous. It actually makes rounds. It goes on a tour. People come to visit it as if it's kind of the spectacle of the era. It was a must-see of the day. So it measures over 12 feet in width. You can go to the Metropolitan Museum now and see it. It's prominently displayed in their American wing. And at the time, it was purchased by a collector for $10,000, which was the most that any American painting had been sold for at the time. So Church becomes quite wealthy. He becomes very successful. And another little anecdote I'll share is that he created scenes in which, or rather settings in which his paintings would be displayed, and he would charge 25 cents for people to come and view these artworks, which I think shows his entrepreneurial spirit and a little bit of this marketing sense that I think would have come in handy for Church today. The reason why I wanted to show this is not only to talk a little bit about his bio and kind of how he came to be the man that could afford to create the masterwork that is Olana, but also to think about his mechanism of working. So this comes out of a trip that he made to the Andes. He goes and travels and really spends time in these places, later creating these immersive works that people can experience. Another kind of point of reference for those of you who might be familiar with 19th century trends is the 19th century panorama. So this was kind of an experience in which people would pay to visit these large scale paintings to give a full sense of a place. And I think that that's something that's very tied to what Church is doing here. So I hope it's working for you now. Please let me know if there's anything that's not functioning. So with all of that, a lot of prologue to the topic of the hour, Olana. So here's a painting I just wanted to show of Olana before we kind of talk a little bit more about this very special place. So oftentimes, before I go in, I just want to say, has anyone been to Olana? I know that some of us have chimed into the chat that you have been. So if anyone has been, please chime in with something you remember or something that you recall from your visit. Oftentimes when people think of Olana, they think of the main house, which I'm showing a photograph of that here. And how could you not? It is such an amazing and unique structure. But something that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today is Olana in its entirety. So a lot of times, like I mentioned, people think local students in Hudson often think of the castle. That's what a lot of students that we lead field trips with refer to the main house as. But Olana really refers to this entire site, this site of creation and artistic inspiration that is comprised of 250 acres that Frederic Church designs and basically implements over the span of several years. So I mentioned the first parcel of land that he acquires is in 1860. And so just looking at this map, this was a map that was done in 1886 by Church's son. But looking at this map, that's this parcel of land here. If I zoom in, you can see, you might be able to see a key word here that'll give you a clue to what this parcel of land was the word orchard. So this parcel of land was actually a working farm. Church acquires it, and he decides to create his own working farm, which he becomes quite proud of. Over many years, he begins to acquire other parcels of land, which we'll talk a little bit about. He also puts in a man-made lake, which you can see here. He covers many of the areas that had been deforested with newly planted trees, all native species that were native to this region. And he also puts in 5 miles of carriage roads, which I'll be showing a video about in a bit. So back to the farm complex. As I mentioned, this was kind of, you know, this is such a pun, but the seed of Olana, the first place that Olana is. For many years, he refers to Olana as the farm, actually. So before it is known as Olana among the family, it's referred to as the farm. And this is where he lives with his wife, Isabel, and his children at the very beginning of their family life. So they use this site as a kind of country home, a summer and winter home, and they live in this area, Cozy Cottage, which was a new farmhouse that church puts on the property. There had been some existing structures that he takes down, and instead he builds this Cozy Cottage, as it was referred to. We have a sketch here that church did of Cozy Cottage, which I just love to show with an image of Cozy today. It still stands. My office is actually in this part of the building. So thankfully, many of these buildings and structures are so beautifully preserved and restored. And something I like to talk a little bit about is the history of the farm. So when I say farm, I mean farm. It really was a working farm, and one that Mr. Church was quite proud of. In 1863, he writes to his father, "The farm looks better than ever before. The peach, pear, and plum trees are a sight. The apple trees are just beginning to come out. We have a coop of 15 chickens by the house, and his son Herbert feeds them out of his hand." So they really were operating, you know, not an ornamental farm. There was a kitchen garden which they would use to feed their family, and he was very, very proud of this. There's another great quote that I don't have on the slide, but I'll just share with you. He wrote to a friend, "Here I am on my own farm about an hour south of Albany. I'm at the center of the world and I own it." And so it was a place of pride and a place of real refuge for church. But I do want to just share a small clip to showcase the work that some of the other pieces of work that he puts into the property. I'll just make a note that this here is one of the views from Olana. I saw someone type into the chat that magnificent view, part of what they remember from visiting. And yes, here we have a view. This is that lake that I mentioned that church put in. And here is part of the parkland or grassland that church also puts in on the property. So he actually is able to take some of the peaty, swampy muck, which it was called in the day, that was unearthed from excavating this area of the land to create the lake. He's able to cover parts of the property with that and then grow grasses, which create this parkland. But without further ado, let me bring us to our video. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to show a few moments of this video. This is part of our virtual tour that we created in the middle of our COVID shutdown. And it showcases, there's about 10 sections. It's a landscape tour. So I encourage you all to go to our website and visit some of these videos if you want to learn more. So I'm just going to play a few moments to give us a sense of what it's like to really traverse Olana and be at Olana.
Frederic Church designed and built more than 5 miles of carriage roads at Olana. This road system is a network of utilitarian routes which serve the needs of daily life at Olana, as well as pleasure drives for the church family and their guests. In the 19th century, Olana was experienced on foot, on horseback, and in carriages. In addition to horse-drawn carriages, the church was also known to import white donkeys from Syria, and guests would venture outdoors on donkey carts.
The roads at Olana were built over many years Church constructed the roads with a reddish-brown shale, which was quarried on site, and this native stone blended with the natural scenery of Olana. In 1871, Church wrote of Olana and his wife, Isabel.
How many hundred forest trees have been set out in its parks lately, and above all, how the artist's beautiful wife has been seen riding across these red-veined, milk-white donkey.
So I think I'll end there because what an amazing image. I just love that quote, the notion of these red veined hilltops with Isabel riding these white donkeys. So let me just pull back our slideshow here. Apologies for all the moving. And let me know if how the audio is doing as well. So please keep me posted. So as I mentioned, I have a question in the chat. Yes, so where is Cozy Cottage located in relationship to the main house? So I'll go back to our map for a second. So Cozy Cottage is located down here by the farm complex. And as I mentioned, Church acquires these parcels of land over a period of many years, eventually acquiring this top piece of the site, which previously had actually been a wood lot. So he acquires this top piece, and this is where he builds the main house, which many people refer to as Olana. Thank you, John, for your question. So I like the idea of thinking about Isabel, Mrs. Church, traveling through the site, but I also like to think a little bit about many of the visitors that Church had come to the site as he was designing this immersive environment. So this is an artwork that he commissioned someone to do, Arthur Parton, and it's an artwork that we have on one of our panels at the park. We have one for interpretive purposes, and the reason is because it really gives a view of how much changed, how much of the landscape that you're looking at Olana is part of this designed landscape. So while we're looking at this view and it might look quite naturalistic, there is intent behind almost everything that you see. So here you can see what it looked like in 1864, and you notice that the lake is not there. I can kind of oscillate between the two screens to give us a sense. As I mentioned, many of the trees had been deforested. The land was heavily utilized for our agricultural purposes. So many of these trees that Church planted are not there. And as well, you can see that the roads, obviously the roads being one of the biggest pieces of Church's design. I'll just bring us to a contemporary view of this same view and read a quote that I absolutely love from Church, which gives a sense of how important the planting of these trees were to him. For several seasons after I selected the spot as my home, I thought of hardly anything but planting trees. And so while we might think of gardening as planting flowers or planting specific bushes, planting something that's very specifically oriented to look like it was planted, Church is doing something quite different here. And often a great point of comparison might be Central Park or the work of Frederic instead. So he's planting these trees to look very natural, to look like this piece of naturalist landscape. And for that reason, he's also, Sharon, you guessed my question. He was planting native species of trees. So hemlock, maple, birch. Yes, that was something that he was keenly aware of and thinking quite a bit about. So I just have this image once again to showcase that these roads and these trees and the lake, it not only was something that was put in for aesthetic effect to create this environment, but it was something that was experienced. As was mentioned in the video, the family members would travel on these white donkeys. I absolutely love this image of daughter Downey and her grandmother riding on the donkey cart, but it was something that was meant to be experienced. And that's the case today. This is a great quote that kind of showcases the artistic possibility that Church saw in the design of Olana, in the structure of these roads, and in creating something that could be experienced. He writes, "I've made about 1¾ miles of road this season, opening entirely new and beautiful views. I can make more and better landscapes in this way than by tampering with canvas and paint in the studio." And I love this quote. the fact that an artist who becomes so famous and so well known for painting says that he may have discovered a way to make more and better landscapes, I think it really speaks to churches' understanding of the power of this way of working. And just to showcase this, I have two images here. This is actually a work by the artist, Catskill Mountains from the home of the artist, which was done in 1871, and a contemporary view from Olana today. So you can come and visit and see many of the views from which it was working, see some of these living landscapes that's made mention of here. I have another question from Sharon. Was he a plein air painter? That question because Church's way of working was unique in that he would make these very furiously quick sketches when he was traveling or when he would be out making observational sketches. He would go on sketching expeditions. That was something that was quite popular in the 19th century. And then many of these sketches would be brought back to his studio where he would compose these large scale paintings. So he wasn't always working plein air. He wasn't working plein air in the landscape. He was making these documents and documentation of what he was seeing. We have some sketches, actually. I wish I had one in my slideshow, but maybe I can send it out to you all afterwards, of him, sketches he did of the sky where he annotates the color of the clouds. He makes annotations so that he can bring these observations back to his studio and create this composed view of what he was seeing. That compositional element and creating something that is composed and not always illustrative of what he's seeing is something that's also part of his work. And that is interesting when you're thinking about this work here, because at the time that Church would have been looking out onto the Hudson, there likely would have been steamers, crafts, various boats traveling through. This was a thoroughfare for business. So he probably removed a little bit of that when he worked on making this painting. I'm just going to jump ahead because there's that ties a little bit to that, and I'll go back. This is from one of Church's visitors. And she wrote that the main house stands at an elevation of 600 feet above the Hudson River, commands wonderful views of sky, mountains, rolling and savanna country, villages, forests, and clearing. And the noble river expands to a width of over 2 miles, forming a lake-like sheet of water, which is always dotted with steamers and other craft. So with that, we can think a little bit about some of that artistic license that Church made because he was working in this specific way. So going back to this compositional element of the landscape, these are some photographs that I've taken just while walking on site. And I think it really shows how much composition plays into the experience of the site, how much it plays into the design of the landscape. There really are these framed views, these kind of key views that you are getting to experience that were part of Church's vision and parts of his intent for traveling through the site. Just to give you some point of reference, this image here was taken from one side of the lake. So there is a road at Olana called Lake Road where you can walk all around the lake or take a donkey cart all around. And at a certain point, you end up looking back at the main house. This is no mistake. This was a view that was very intentional. This is a view from one of the approach roads. So approaching the main house, guests would have come up. They would be driving in their carriages and they would come to approach the main house. I mean, if you think of, I can't think of a better way to build suspense as you're traveling to visit someone than this long arching road that goes up and leads all the way to the main house. Here is another view which actually showcases a studio edition wing, which we're going to look inside in a few moments. And this here is another framed view that we look back at. And at the Olana Partnership, maintaining these views and preserving these views is a large part of the work that we do. So to the main house, many of you probably are itching to get inside. And I'm sure many of Church's guests, when they're taken on these long carriage rides, probably felt the same way. So here is an image of one of the sketches that Church did. So Church was instrumental in the design of his house. Oftentimes when we're leading tours, we get the question of, you know, did he design it? Was he the engineer? How much of a role did this artist really play in the design of his home? And the answer is very much so. He was the chief, the chief kind of contractor. He was the person who was often hiring those workers who would be working on the house and implementing what they would do each day. And in our archives, we have hundreds and hundreds of sketches that Church did while he was planning for the design of the house. Yes, and Sandy has a comment in here that it looks quite Moorish. And something that I want to think a little bit about is, we've talked a little bit about place as this source of inspiration. And this was something that was very true for the design of the main house. So just to think a little bit about the timeline, in 1867, acquires that top parcel of land. He was very excited about acquiring that piece of land. There's a quote where he says that he paid quite a bit for that piece of land, but it was fully worth it because he would be able to, I'm paraphrasing by the way, but he would be able to complete this perfect view of his vision. And so something that happens is, at that same time, around the same time that he purchases this land, he was also planning for an 18-month journey for he and his family throughout the Holy Land. So here I have an image from that wonderful trip that they went on, he and Isabel, for 18 months. And this was something that we like to think about in terms of the inspiration that he got for his house. So the main destination, as I said, was the Holy Land. Traveled to what was then Syria. They also spent a lot of time in Beirut. So this is actually an image from his time there. And we can see that many of the aspects of the house have resonance with some of the buildings and some of the structures that they would have seen. Sharon has a question here. How did he meet Isabel? Thank you for asking. He met, I believe he met at the showcase of his Heart of the Andes. So I believe that that's when around the same time that they met. So yes. So did Church take photos of the landscape? So Church was not, he didn't photograph the landscapes. We do have many sketches of the landscapes, and we do have photography in the collection. Many of them are not necessarily attributed to Church. We do have some photography in our collection. So as I said, his travels through the Middle East, through parts of Europe, were instrumental to his design of the main house. A little anecdote that we like to tell is that he had a very different vision for the main house. We think that it would have, he was planning in a little bit of a different direction. And after coming back from this trip, he ends up sketching something that ends up being much more inspired by this trip to the Middle East. We can't talk about his trip to the Middle East without highlighting one of his other very famous works, of a sketch of Petra that he did. And this was something that I highlight because we'll be seeing it again inside the main house. So great. And with that, I think it's time to get inside. So just keep this in mind, this view of Petra, this idea of his travels inspiring his design. And why don't we dive right in? So just bear with me one moment. Okay, great. So here we are. This is actually the main room that visitors would have entered. So we are standing in the front entryway of the main house, as if we've just taken that long carriage ride, and now we're standing in the front entryway. If at any point the technology gets a little bit slow, please let me know. Just type something into the chat and I'll slow down as I move through. Just to give you all some background, this is actually new technology that we're launching this year with, we're so grateful to have the support of Art Bridges. We were able to create a three-dimensional view of the interior of the house through this technology called Matterport. So we're very, very happy to have that. So visitors would come through, and this was designed as the kind of entryway or sitting room, this space. So the formal sitting room for guests as they would come inside. So this was something that we're not quite sure how much use it got, but it was something that was designed as kind of this entryway. People would sit. The furniture is not the most comfortable, so you can definitely see that the use there was not necessary for a family living room by any means. While we go through, I do just want to make a plug for looking through the viewpoints that are created by the house. I think a question came through about the origin of the name Olana, and I'll mention that now because I do think it's quite relevant as we go through. So we think that the origin of the name Olana actually came from Isabel, his wife, and we believe that it was based on a passage in Strabo's geography. And Olana, I think it was referred to as Olane, and it was the Olane referred to a site in Asia Minor that was a gem house or a treasure house overlooking a fertile river valley. And so you set me up for the best segue, because I'll just take us to this view. Oh, sorry if I'm taking you a little bit all over the place, but you can see that from inside the house, we have these very specific views of the Hudson River Valley, of the areas of parkland and designed landscape that Church had created. So while we'll go through, I'll definitely make note of a few kind of key items and paintings, but something that I like to think about is how the main house functions in the context of the larger environment. So as I mentioned, this would have been the sitting room. Something I'll just say as we're here is that much of the ornamentation is as it once was. It hasn't been necessarily repainted. These are not as they once were. They would have had this luminous effect. The designs and the patterns on the doors, they would have been silver and gold and had a sheen to them. So I like that when you think about the quote from Strabo's Geographica of Olane being this treasure house overlooking a fertile river valley. You know, if you think about that in the context of the design, this kind of shine and element and this ornamentation is definitely a large part of Olana. I pause here because you'll see that many works are hung throughout the house, some of which are Church's himself, done by Church himself, but others by other painters. This is one of Church's works. It's called Autumn, and it was a work that he did that was commissioned by his mother, I believe, one of his first patrons, which I really like. He inherited it back. So Sharon asked, what's the source of the quote? The quote about Olane was pulled from Strabo's Geography. So that was a 12th century text, I believe. And it's one that was in the Church's library, which we will visit in a moment. We started our tour talking a little bit about Cole. And so I'll just mention that there's a work by Cole right here. This is a painting of the Protestant cemetery in Rome. Ooh, I'm zooming in and out, which we can get a better look at. So Church was not only engineer, designer, landscape architect, he was also a collector. So he had many works and many pieces of ephemera throughout the house that relate to his travels and to some of the trips that he took. I'm just going to pause for a moment to make sure that everyone is getting this view. This is one of the most important rooms in the house, the court hall. And so let me just pull the Q&A to make sure. Great. Okay, 1 second. And the court hall is one of the rooms where we can see that inspiration from some of the Middle Eastern and stone structures that the Church has visited very clearly. Something that often I like to think about is that Church originally, I believe, wanted this to be open, to be this kind of open air area. And this would have been very similar to many of the structures that they stayed in that had this open pavilion space, this open courtyard space. Speaking of open spaces, this is another integral part of the design of the house. And this is called the Ombra. This is one of those indoor-outdoor spaces and has one of the most specific and targeted views from the main house. We're looking out onto the Hudson River, the Catskill Mountains in the back, and that is by no means a mistake. So the positionality of the house and the way in which it was oriented gives us this viewpoint, gives us this view back at the Hudson River. This area in the Church family's day would have been, there would have been furniture and plants. It was very much a lived in space. Right now, we don't necessarily have that here because many of the tiles are quite, are original tiles to original Islamic tiles. So it's something that we can't have necessarily people lounging and sitting out there. But I like to think a little bit about how these spaces were used by the Church family. And this large window was a view in which, by which Church positioned his desk. So he had his desk right up against this window and would, make no mistake about it. He was not, not one to not take advantage of this beautiful view. Okay. So I'm going to take us into the sitting room, and here we'll see a familiar painting that we were just looking at. Once again, we have this expansive view, these arched windows adorned with glass detailing that almost indicates a framing, which I think is really interesting. We'll see that throughout the house, and we'll see that again. And here we have Petra. So Petra was a journey, it was a 10-day journey to Petra that Mr. Church took without his wife, Isabel. At the time, Isabel had she was pregnant, so it was a little bit too dangerous for her to make the trip. But something I love about this work of art that is one of Church's more renowned paintings is he completes it after the trip, and he actually chooses to give it to Isabel as a gift. This sitting room was very much, Isabel's kind of domain. You can see this desk here, this carved wooden desk, which I don't know if you can tell on the 3D view, but it's quite small in stature. And Isabel was quite small. So this was her sitting desk and area. The other thing I'll note is that many of the colors in this room resonate and relate to Petra itself. So this room is very much designed kind of centering around Petra. And Cindy's typing in that Petra is an amazing place. Yes. Antonia chimed in, what is the design on the wall left of the ceramic? I'm not sure if it's this room or which room you're referring to. So maybe we can revisit that. I'll leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So the other thing I'll just note is we've talked a little bit about the Islamic influence, the Moorish influence, some of these similarities we're seeing in other designs from other parts of the world, this kind of globalist trend in the house. And this archway here, this kind of decorative molding, actually has some decorative elements that look a little bit like they could be Arabic script, but they're actually not. To my knowledge, no one has been able to translate. So it's this interesting moment in which we're seeing Church using some of these elements from other cultures and places that he was interested in as this decorative piece. And that happens throughout the house, which I think is something that's interesting to examine from a 21st century vantage point. I'll take us back to the court hall just to go back out. This is Church's library. So oftentimes we'll talk about the churches that were, the books that were in the Church's library, and we're referring to this space here. So, and we're entering into a space now that was an additional space put on the house. Church had his original studio a little bit farther down on the main slope looking out to the Hudson River. At the time that he puts his studio there, that was the highest point of the property that he owned. Later, when he acquires this piece of the property, builds the main house, a few years later in 1888, he actually puts on a studio addition. And this kind of corridor is part of that studio addition. So we can travel through, once again, these large windows kind of beckoning a visitor or a family member to look out onto the view. that exterior space is really part of the interior. And something else I'll notice is if we're standing here, from one end, we can see where we entered, and from the other end, we can see right through. So we had a wonderful scholar come and do a webinar with us a little bit about the sight lines. Mary Roberts, she talks about the sight lines at Olana, and that really stayed with me because it's something that's so tied to the site, so tied to Olana. It creates these, almost like a looking glass, these moments where you can look through and it's orienting your viewpoint and your lens. Sharon said that it reminds you a little bit of Frank Lloyd Wright. Really interesting idea, thinking about this design that ties to the landscape, ties to the environment, and connects and kind of pushes you along in a certain direction to look at certain things or view certain things. Yes, so Sandy said, did he send furniture, rugs, and memorabilia back from his trip? So he did. He most definitely brought many things back from his trips. Ooh, and this room specifically, I like to point out because it has many memorabilia from his trips to Mexico. So he actually would spend winters in Mexico. It was a doctor prescribed trip that he would make. He suffered terribly from rheumatoid arthritis. And so this was something that his doctor would prescribe. This drier climate was something that he thought would help. And so you can see these kind of pre-Columbian artifacts over here. Oh, I'm so sorry. But while we're here, I'll just turn us around. And on this, you can see some hats and sombreros. So you can see this influence of the places that he visits, specifically in this room. I think I mentioned this was his studio, and this was his studio space, the studio addition that he puts onto the house. Antonio, the thing you were asking about was mounted on the wall, but it looked like a 4-panel door. I'll travel through and maybe you can let me know if I get to it. So I'm just going to very quickly, because we're running short on time, which always happens at tours of Olana. There's just so much to cover. I'll take us quickly upstairs just so that you all can see a glimpse into the bedroom quarters and the living quarters of the family. And so this is that we're standing right now, where we're standing right now is on top of the court hall where that kind of skylight could have been, or maybe was, you know, where he had hoped for it to be. And once again, I just want to point out these window frames. I might sound like a broken record, but I think it's a really integral thing to look at in the context of his quote about creating more and better landscapes in this way. He puts in these highly decorative windows, which do create this illusion of almost like a frame to a painting, which I think is no mistake. And this was the church's bedroom. We can see this heavily patterned decorative scheme in this space. In this room, we have the church's dressing room. Once again, it's a little bit more subdued, but you can see this patterned wallpaper. And I think we have some questions that have come through. Yes, we have some questions. Source of his significant wealth. His significant wealth, he did come from a wealthy family. So he did come from a family that, you know, was by no means not, you know, wealthy, but he also became very famous for his artwork. As I mentioned, his artwork actually was record-breaking. Heart of the Andes sold for $10,000, which at the time was the most that any American painter had sold an artwork for. So with that, and just showcase too, I don't know if you got a glimpse, this kind of showcases what the ombre may have looked like a little bit. And we have two viewpoints from the house that you might be able to see a little bit more clearly than some of the views you saw in our virtual tour. I do want to make mention that while Olana was a creation of Mr. Church, an earthwork, an artist's masterwork, it was also a family home. It was someplace where he lived with Isabel and his 4 children. His son Louis ends up taking on stewardship of the property, and he ends up living there with his wife Sally for many years. And much of what you saw in our tour today is a credit to Sally, who lived in the house until her death in 1964. She was 96. She did a wonderful job of preserving everything that you saw. I think it's about 98% intact inside the house. Another person in the Olana story that I can't forget to mention is David Huntington, who was an art historian who was thinking and researching the Hudson River School in the 1960s and had spent some time with Sally at the house. And I like this quote that comes from him because it shows just how much we have, the wealth of resources we have at Olana because of the way that the Church family were able to hold on to some of these items. He says that he's absolutely staggered in the attic, this abundance of material, drawings by Church, scores of oil studies, canceled checked journals, prints that the artist had, photographs of the family, paintings by other artists. So it was this trove of a record of an artist's life and of an artist's kind of inspiration. And with that, I just want to kind of make a nod to the saving of Olana, which is a story that we often like to highlight in all of our tours. So thankfully, because of the efforts of Mr. Huntington and others, we were able to prevent the house from being sold. When Sally died in 1964, the house and the entire landscape was put on the market. And thankfully, Huntington asked for a year to raise the funds to buy the property back. It later was acquired by New York State as a New York State site. So to this day, as I mentioned at the beginning of our tour, we are open and free to the public, which is something that we're so excited about, so people can see and use Olana as a resource. Something else that I want to mention is a lot of the work that we do at the Olana Partnership centers around this viewshed preservation. So preserving parts of the view that we've looked at today through the house, through the landscape, preserving these historic views that Church commented on and that Church painted from. And that's something that we put a lot of energy towards. And lastly, I know we're getting close to time, but I just can't help myself. Another thing that we have going on at Olana is, just as we see Olana as this masterwork of Church, this site of inspiration, of creation by a 19th century artist, we're so excited that recently we've been able to bring on contemporary artists to lend their own eye and their own perspective on the site, on the lineage of Church, and on some of the themes that tie into the site as a whole. So pictured here is Jean Shin, a contemporary artist who worked on this installation called Fallen, which I made brief mention of earlier. It's part of our collaborative exhibition that's opening this weekend, Cross-Pollination. And that's an exhibition that we're putting on in concert with Thomas Cole National Historic Site. Jean was able to use this hemlock tree that had to be taken down from the east lawn, the very front of the house, and she was able to transform it into a piece that makes commentary on the ways in which humans interact with the natural environment. In the process of this piece being developed, we were able to date the tree, and we found that it was 140 years old. So it was actually likely planted by Frederic Church himself. So I just think it points to the ways in which Olana, as a historic site, as a public park, as a site of inspiration, can exist on a continuum between the past, the 19th century, and artists that are living and communing with the environment today. So with that, I just want to open it up to questions. I know we have a little bit of time left. And so I had a question about the landscaping. So of course, so as I mentioned, the design of the landscape of the site was very intentional. So Church planted thousands of trees on the property. Something that I don't have an image of to show you all, but let me see if I can pull it up in our virtual tour. So sit with me for a moment. We have, in addition to the 3D view of the house, we have a 360 view of the landscape. And I'm going to type that into the chat so that you all can view it at your leisure. And something that I want to make sure I can show you is that stands, I think, in stark contrast to the design of the entire site is the Mingled flower garden. The Mingled flower garden, here we go. So just one moment. So you all can view this by clicking the link that I put in the chat. But this is that historic approach road that we traveled at the very beginning of the video that I showed. And flanking this retaining wall where the road is built is this area here, which is referred to as the Mingled flower garden. This drone footage was taken in September, so we can't see many of the blooms that you can see if you come to visit Olana today. But this Mingled flower garden, the way the story goes is that it was a request of Isabel Church and potentially Downey Church's daughter. They wanted a kind of typical Victorian flower garden, and the compromise was that it would be put here so that from inside the house, which is located right here, you wouldn't be able to see the very kind of manicured, man-created planted flower garden, but it would be obscured by this wall. And so you could still look out onto this naturalistic designed landscape. The other kind of interesting point about the placement of this garden, though, is that it's up against this retaining wall. So it traps quite a bit of heat. I live in Hudson, New York, and I'm 10 minutes away from Olana, but the flowers by my house bloom about, I think, a week after the flowers in the Mingled flower garden. It could just be I'm not as good of a gardener as our master gardener, but it definitely gets quite hot, and so those blooms pop open. It's been wonderful chatting with you all. I see that John asked, embellished wall around doorways, local artisans. Yeah, so local craftsmen and artisans were an integral part of the development of Olana. Many of the painted pieces that you saw on the inside and on the outside of the building were put in with design stencils that Church designed.
Carolyn, thank you so much. This has been outstanding.
Oh,
and
welcome.
I can't wait to go and revisit Olana.
Enjoy. Have a lovely evening, everyone.